Okay, so I will just start with the introductory notes while people are still arriving. I don't want us to run over time. So a big welcome to everybody. Thank you all for coming to this Resources Conservation and Recycling webinar event. My name is Mitchell Jones. I'm the Outreach Editor at Resources Conservation and Recycling, and I will be your host for today and for the foreseeable future also. So just a couple of notes for the people who are joining a webinar for the first time, one of our webinars for the first time. Our webinars are run every second Thursday at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. They are conducted in English, and they cover the entire scope of the journal. So we aim to give you a diverse program of all sorts of topics that you expect to see in the Resource Conservation and Recycling Journal. And we ask our speakers to also deliver their presentation with the audience in mind, audience accessibility. So we aim to have presentations that are accessible to as many people as possible, that as many people as possible find interesting and engaging. Just a quick note that registration is necessary. So in order to join the webinars, you do need to register. The registration link is in the Resources Conservation and Recycling email, the newsletter that is sent at the end of each month. Also available on our social media pages, and in the near future, and will also be posted on the journal homepage, the Elsevier journal homepage. For those of you that are not able to join or register as a result of the capacity limitation that we have, which is 500 attendees, you are able to view the webinar via live stream on YouTube. You can also return to YouTube at a later date to watch the webinars, as many webinars as you like, at your leisure. The YouTube channel is youtube.com/@RCR Journal. Final note, we are aiming to develop this program to really be the sort of program that our viewers want to watch. So we do value your feedback. At the end of this webinar, you will be prompted to submit some feedback. It will take 2 minutes, 5 questions. If you have the time, we do appreciate the feedback. If not, that's also okay. So I will just jump now to our event program. So I'll just share that with you now. So we've just had our welcome address. In a moment, we're going to have an introduction to the journal. Then I'm going to introduce our speaker for today, Bala, which we are very fortunate to have Bala with us today. Thank you, Bala. And we're going to quickly duck into the sort of operational procedures of how we're going to run things. Today and every webinar is going to be run in the same way. Then Bala's going to give his presentation, which is approximately 20 minutes. We're going to have 10 minutes for questions, and then the closing remarks and the information on the next event. So a couple of notes quickly on the journal, assuming you all know the journal, but makes sense to see why we're here. Our scope is broad. We're interested in all things resources, conservation, and recycling, clues in the name. Broad scope, big picture thinking, systems-wide strategies, technological, economic, institutional, policy focus, resource management practices, conservation, recycling, resource substitution, resource productivity improvement, restructuring, production and consumption profiles, and transformation of industry. In terms of how our webinars are run, please all communication in English. So if you have questions or such, please provide them in English. We do have closed captions available. They seem to be working fairly well today, based on what I'm seeing pop up on the screen. They were a bit of a disaster for the first webinar. They didn't really capture at all what was going on, but they seem to be working okay today. Please post any questions that you have in the Q&A during the presentation. If you see a question in the Q&A that you also are interested in hearing the answer to, then please upload it. We will discuss the questions in the order of popularity. If we have extra question time at the end, so within that 10 minutes, we've got through the feed and we have some extra time, then it is also possible for any audience members to come via camera and video, join us for a little bit of a chat about the topic, if time permits. So without further ado, I will introduce our speaker for today, Bala, from the National University of Singapore. He's going to be speaking with us on the topic of bio-waste-derived three-dimensional carbon foam for selective carbon dioxide capture. Professor Bala has established an internationally recognized research program to study and solve environmental problems of major concern. His research has resulted in about 260 papers with more than 19,000 citations and an H-index of 77. He is a recipient of many research awards, notably Alan Bergman Research Publication Award, Highly Cited Research Article Award, and the Professional and Scholarly Excellence Award. He is the lead author for the United Nations Environment Programme's 6th Global Environment Outlook report. He is a member of the science panel of the Asia Pacific Clean Air Partnership and is an elected fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry. So thank you so much, Bala. I'll hand the stage over to you. I'm very excited to hear your presentation.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Mitchell, do you hear me? Am I audible? Excellent. All right. Yeah, I'm speaking physically from Singapore. The local time in Singapore at the moment, it's 10 minutes past 1 o'clock in the morning. So hopefully whatever I would say would make sense. If not, I have an excuse. So thank you, Mitchell, for the kind introduction and also for organizing this event. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the RCR team for organizing this webinar series. This is something of its kind. Not many international journals that I know of have this kind of program. So I really appreciate this opportunity given to me to talk to all of you. Okay, let me see if the slides actually work. Hopefully it does. All right, here we go. As you know, achieving zero carbon emission is not an option, but an obligation for all countries across the world in the context of achieving the Paris target. So having said that, different countries have adopted or continue to adopt different strategies to achieve this goal. And so in that context, it's very important to look at the viable opportunities that we have to directly capture carbon dioxide and also capture carbon dioxide from the flue gas apart from the ambient air. And these two targets are rather very challenging because we have to have viable materials in the context of absorption or adsorption of carbon dioxide from flue gas. But in terms of absorbing CO2 directly from the air, of course, we have to have more trees. We have to densify trees and so on. So I just want to give a kind of broad framework as to how we could possibly achieve these two goals in terms of minimizing carbon emissions so that we can still achieve net zero carbon emission as a whole in a country. So the title of my talk is Synthesis of Bio-Waste-derived Carbon Foam for CO2 Capture. So this is really an innovative work in terms of converting what's considered to be a waste material into a resource, and which is nothing but carbon foam that we are talking about. So this carbon foam has unique and outstanding properties in terms of being able to selectively capture CO2 with a high degree of capacity. So I will tell you more about it as I go along. So this is going to be the outline of my talk. I want to give a broad introduction as to why we have to do biomass recycling, and then why it's important for us to synthesize carbon foam in terms of capturing CO2 effectively. Then I will talk about the kind of work that we have done, which has been published in the RCR journal. And then finally, I'll summarize my talk and then share some perspectives as to what we could do further in terms of contributing to decarbonization. So everybody knows that photosynthesis is very important, especially for plants to continue to grow, which requires the absorption of CO2 in the air together with water vapor in the presence of sunlight. And this photosynthesis process would convert carbon dioxide into useful chemicals that are stored in plants. So the question is, once the lifetime of vegetation is over, the traditional practice is to burn it up. Like, for example, we have agricultural residues, horticultural residues, or any type of organic waste residues. The conventional practice used to burn such materials to get rid of the volume of waste. In the process, we end up emitting even more carbon dioxide than what we usually have. And therefore, this option is not acceptable, and we had to do something about it. And the way to overcome this problem is to convert biomass waste into useful materials. For example, biochemicals, biofuels, or biomaterials. And having said that, this conversion of biomass waste into value-added products is a challenging task, because we have to identify an appropriate technology and use it under certain conditions in order for us to get the products that we are looking for with a high amount. In other words, high yield, and with also high purity as well. And the way to do the conversion of bio-waste into useful carbonaceous products is to sort of process the waste under different temperatures. And depending on the temperatures at which we do the thermal treatment, you get products accordingly. So typically when you do a low temperature treatment, hydrothermal carbonization, we end up having biochar, activated carbon, and so on. And of course, if we carry out pyrolysis in the absence of oxygen at a relatively higher temperature, you get better products. For example, fluorine, carbon, graphene, and so on. But what actually we are looking for is nothing but a 3D, three-dimensional carbon macrostructure. That kind of material would have superior properties in terms of removing CO2 from the flue gas and potentially from the ambient air as well. So in order for us to get the 3D carbon macrostructure, we have to address all these transformation pathways in one go, which would cut across, for example, decomposition of bio-macromolecules, and we break it down into smaller fragments, and the smaller fragments in turn will undergo polymerization and eventually leading to aromatization, meaning integration of different aromatic compounds that we have in the breakdown products of bio-macromolecules. And that in turn will lead to high density carbon, in other words, carbonization, and eventually leading to graphitization, which is an important precursor or a requirement to form 3D carbon macrostructure. So I will tell you more about as to how we could bring all these transformation pathways together using a novel technology, which is what we have published in our paper. Having said that, when it comes to carbon foam, which is nothing but the 3D macromolecular structure, it can exist in two different forms. For example, it could be an open cell carbon form, or it could be close to cell carbon form, excuse me. So what we are looking for is more like a closed cell carbon form, because that has high level of porosity. So we have multi-porous structure, which is also very rigid. In other words, it will have high mechanical strength as well. So that's the kind of carbon form that we were targeting initially as part of our research, and I will tell you as to how we achieved our target through the synthesis work. And of course, initially you have to convert the biomass waste into various materials that we are looking for. In particular, we are talking about carbon foam. So having said that, traditionally carbon foam is still available in the consumer market, but it's produced from petroleum pitches or petroleum products or precursors, which is not good because we end up emitting carbon. So instead, if we can make use of biomass waste, so then we turn waste into a resource. This is what we are looking for. And the ideal properties of carbon foam should be, it should have lightweight, and it should have high mechanical strength, and preferably large surface area, so that it can sequester carbon dioxide and accumulate it onto the surface to the extent feasible. If we can do that, then that kind of material, carbon foam, can be explored for a variety of applications, cutting across adsorption, energy storage, and also for thermal management as well. So as I mentioned before, usually this kind of carbon foam is made from fossil fuels. Of course, fossil fuels are dirty. We don't want to continue to use them anymore. On the other hand, biomass is a viable feedstock that we could use it for this kind of application. But again, what has been attempted in the past is to add some chemical foaming agents, cross-linking agents. So adding chemical reagents to prepare carbon foam is again not a good idea, because this is not an environmentally benign process, and we wanted to avoid the use of chemicals. Instead, we just want to convert the waste to biomass directly into carbon foam with no addition of any chemicals of any type. And then this is what we have done over here. So basically what we have done is to collect bio waste, which is a renewable feedstock, which is also abundant, is also cheap at the same time, easily accessible. So given that, it's a very good idea to explore the use of bio waste to make carbon foam. But the challenge here is to sort of convert bio waste into several fragments, for which we need to have lignocellulosic biomass, because one of the ingredients that we need to make carbon foam will be lignin. So if you look at the tree structure, especially the stem, it is very rigid. The rigidity of the tree structure is a result of the lignin component we have in the biomass. So this is what we wanted to extract, because that has a lot of aromatic compounds and rich in carbon. So if we can extract lignin selectively, and then you can convert it into carbon foam through a process called self-foaming without adding any chemical reagents externally. This is what we have done. So in this instance, we used palm kernel, which is like a product that you get from palm oil industry, which is kind of increasing in numbers these days in the interest of producing palm oil. And you get some byproducts, and then if you could sort of crush it and make powder, you can break it into two components. One is the palm kernel fruit, which we could use to make bio oil, which I'm not going to talk about. So instead of the powder you get, that's a palm kernel shell. It can be sort of pre-treated by adding water and then drying it at about 60 degrees Celsius to get rid of the moisture, some impurities, and so on. Afterwards, what we have done is to do the hydrothermal carbonization, which is more like a pressure cooker in simple terms. So you have a closed vessel, you add your the biomass feedstock, which is the PKS that we have from kernel shell, together with water. You completely seal the reactor, you heat it up to about 250 degrees Celsius, and then the pressure is generated automatically because of the closed tube vessel. Under those conditions, you could sort of convert, you can do the depolymerization of biomass into various fragments. In particular, we are talking about lignin, and that can in turn can lead to carbon foam. So this is what is usually done. This is a conventional hydrothermal carbonization process. You heat it up to 250 degrees Celsius, you get the carbon powder, and unfortunately, this pathway does not produce lignin. It's kind of lost, or you don't have a significant amount of lignin. So instead, we modify the conventional hydrothermal process. So this is one of the components of the novelty of our work. And so when you sort of modify the conventional hydrothermal carbonization process by adding some alkali or whatever, followed by acid, and then you get this lignin in a large amount. And then you can process lignin through pyrolysis, which will lead to carbon foam that we are talking about, which is a 3D macromolecular structure with a high level of porosity, high level of surface area and rigidity, so that it will be regenerated and continue to be used number of times for this kind of application in terms of removal of CO2. So these are the steps involved in the synthesis of carbon foam that I've been talking about. And then you take the feedstock, which is waste to biomass, and it has three components: cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. This is a typical composition of biomass. And what we are looking for is lignin, and then you put it into the reactor and then add water, and then you process it at a temperature of 250 degrees Celsius, and you get kind of a black liquid, of course, after the addition of alkali. And the black liquid, it has some amount of lignin in it. And then once you add an acid to it, it forms a precipitate. You know, you see a very thick brown precipitate, which is nothing but lignin that we got over here. And then you sort of dry it up and then put it in a pyrolysis reactor with no oxygen. That's why we get nitrogen. You heat it up to 600 degrees Celsius for about 2 hours, and you get a fantastic product. That's carbon foam that we are looking for. So this carbon foam has a lot of interesting applications, including the removal of carbon dioxide. So let me give you some insights as to what kind of chemical transformation pathway is actually happening in the process of depolymerization of the biomacromolecule to produce lignin and eventually carbon foam. So now you could see over here, you have all these chemical compounds, which I don't want to discuss in detail. These are all important components of lignin. So once you do the kind of pyrolysis, what's happening here is that all these aromatic compounds will sort of form macromolecule, as you can see over here. This is the kind of a huge macromolecule, and through graphitization, that will produce carbon foam eventually, which is kind of rigid. So we got done sort of a 2D NMR characterization, which I don't want to go into details at the moment. But using this chemical technique, we were able to provide insights in terms of the chemical transformations that are happening in terms of conversion of the waste to biomass into carbon foam. So to provide further insights, we basically compared the two different components of biomass waste, the one that is produced traditionally with no treatment in terms of addition of alkali or acid, and you get the carbon powder, which we don't want. So instead, we are looking for carbon foam, and that involves some pre-treatment with the addition of an alkali in a low amount and acid again in a low amount, and eventually you get this kind of macro structure that we have over here. So how do we produce that? So you can imagine once you get lignin out of the hydrothermal reactor, when you do the pyrolysis, and you have a series of processes happening in a sequential manner, that will eventually lead to the carbon foam. This is what we call as self-foaming. So it's a self-polymerization or aromatization process that's happening over here. So initially you have this polymerization, and then later on you volatilize certain gases from the product over here, and you could see the kind of pores we have here. We have a combination of micro, meso, and macro pores. So tiny little pores we have in the product, which are very important in terms of selectively capturing CO2 and concentrating it onto the material of choice. And eventually, when you do the pyrolysis through graphitization, you get the carbon foam that we have here. This is what I call the feedstock, lignin, and processed at a temperature of 600 degrees Celsius through pyrolysis. Okay, so this is a kind of image of the material that we have prepared. Like I said before, so what we are looking for is the closed cell carbon foam, which is what indeed we have. As you could see over here, we have a cell wall, and then you have the ligament and so on. So the cell wall and ligament will basically integrate the macrostructure to provide the rigidity that we have with our carbon foam. That's one of the important requirements we have. At the same time, the windows here would represent the kind of pores that we have, tiny little pores we have in the material. That's important for the CO2 gas to diffuse from the gas phase into the interface over here, and that will be kind of locked in. This is how the adsorption process would occur over here. And then this is the transmission electron microscope to give the morphology of the product on a very tiny scale, in a nanoscale. And what you could see over here, especially in this image, which is nothing but graphene, the so-called graphene, and which is a wonderful chemical that we are able to make it, and through pyrolysis or other biomass feedstock, waste biomass over here. So this is what we call in chemistry sp2 hybridized carbon. So the presence of sp2 hybridized carbon is an important requirement to form carbon foam, which we managed to achieve through our synthesis. On the other hand, if you look at the carbon powder that you produce conventionally using the same hydrothermal reactor with no pre-treatment, you have heterogeneous carbon particles that are not aggregated. They don't form macromolecular structure, and therefore their properties are relatively inferior to what you would have with carbon foam. So then we compare the adsorption capacity in terms of removal of carbon dioxide, the so-called greenhouse gas that contributes to global warming and therefore climate change. And so these two materials are able to remove carbon dioxide. However, the lignin-based carbon foam is able to remove more carbon dioxide than what it could remove with the carbon powder. That's a key outcome of this result. And in chemistry, we call this one is more like I-shaped isotherm. There's an adsorption capacity as to how much of CO2 is removed and kept or retained onto the surface. And this I isotherm is indicative of the presence of micropores, meaning the pores would have diameter less than 1 nanometer, which is something typical of carbon foam that we have over here. All right, so to provide further evidence in terms of the multi-porous structure of carbon foam, you could see all the pores we have. Again, I don't want to go into details, but what I would like to highlight here, you could see less than 1 nanometer. These are the micropores that we have in our carbon foam. So these micropores play an important role in terms of sequestering carbon dioxide and retaining it onto the surface through diffusion, followed by adsorption. At the same time, we also have a little bit higher pores. We call it mesopores and macropores, which would be complementary to the role played by micropores. In other words, if we have multi-porous structure carbon foam, it will turn out to be more effective in removing carbon dioxide than just a monoporous kind of carbon structure, carbon foam. So this is the actual adsorption process that takes place when you introduce carbon dioxide from the air into the material. We have carbon foam, and you could see over here initially, we are using nitrogen, and later on we are comparing it with carbon dioxide. And initially you could see over here, this is the temperature regime, and increase the temperature of the material, and then you basically volatilize, whatever you have, in particular water vapor. Then you have a very dry material of carbon foam. Then you reduce the temperature down to 35 degrees Celsius, and then you could see the adsorption takes place for nitrogen. In other words, the weight of the material increases. The reason why the weight of the material increases is because it's able to remove nitrogen and keep it onto the surface. However, when the same material is introduced to carbon dioxide, the weight gain is much more significant as compared to nitrogen, which would indicate that our carbon foam is much more selective towards carbon dioxide as compared to nitrogen. Just imagine in the flue gas that we get from industries, you have a combination of both nitrogen and carbon dioxide. So if your material is going to be exposed to nitrogen more than carbon dioxide, then whatever active sites we have on the surface will be all saturated. And therefore, you may not be able to remove carbon dioxide anymore. So the selectivity of the material is very, very important attribute, which we are able to demonstrate beyond any reasonable doubt. And certainly carbon dioxide can be preferentially, selectively removed to a much larger extent in the presence of nitrogen, which is the important outcome of our study. And again, to provide further evidence, we sort of studied the removal of carbon dioxide with other materials, unprocessed PKS, with no hydrothermal treatment, very little removal of CO2. When you compare it with a carbon powder versus a carbon foam, you see better performance of carbon foam. But when you increase the temperature, the performance tends to be even better, which shows that our material carbon foam could be operated at various temperatures depending on the requirements an industry would have. And what's even more important for us is to realize that the adsorption capacity is much larger for our carbon foam as compared to all other products that we could get for the same feedstock. That is the PKS, the biomass feedstock. They don't have such a strong attribute in terms of removal of CO2. Okay, so then we want to compare our material with all other materials that are potentially available for industries to use. And so this kind of a comparative evaluation is very important for us to make an appropriate selection of the material. And you could see over here, once again, our carbon foam has superior properties at 2 different temperatures as compared to all other materials, most other materials, I would say. But these are all synthetic materials. What we got here is out of waste to biomass. So that's why the journal Resources Conservation and Recycling is so interested in our work, because that contributes to the overall mission we have in terms of sustainability. To summarize, this is what we have achieved in our work. So we have converted waste into treasure. So trash to treasure is what we have done. And the treasure is the carbon foam. That's a valuable feedstock, valuable material we got out of waste material. And through chemical synthesis, in particular, with the use of the generation of lignin, and that's an important precursor to form carbon foam through a process called self-forming that occurs, especially when you do pyrolysis in the absence of oxygen. So what's a large practical outcome of this work? So basically, this work contributes to circular economy. So in circular economy, we don't want to use raw materials multiple number of times, which will lead to depletion of raw materials and therefore unsustainable development. But instead here, we are making use of waste to biomass to make the material over here, and therefore it leads to zero waste to generation. But more importantly, we come up with economically attractive product, which is also environmentally benign at the same time. As the picture shows, this material has multi-porous macrostructure with a high level of rigidity, and therefore it can be used multiple number of times after regeneration, which further contributes to sustainability because we are not consuming any virgin materials. Instead, the same material made out of the waste biomass could be used multiple number of times. So these are the key take-home messages. But what I have explained to you so far is the ability of our material to sequester CO2 from industry flue gases. And what we are looking for now is the direct capture of CO2 from the air. And right now we have a 420 ppm of CO2, and that what is contributed to global warming. So that's our next challenge, is to use the same material in some modification so that it would have enhanced capability of directly removing CO2. And hopefully we will complete this work in about a year from now. So with that, I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much. I welcome questions from the audience, if any.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Bala. Actually, I'm sorry, I'm just going to mute my audio. I do have some issues with my audio, but you really nailed the accessibility criteria there. I think I really enjoyed how accessible you made that, the introductory notes and how you assembled everything all together. I really thought you did a great job with that. So I'm sure that many of the audience will appreciate that. Thank you very much, Bala, for that.
Thank you so much, Mitchell, for kind
words. So as Bala said, we are welcoming any questions from the audience, either in the chat, or if you would like to use the raise hand reaction, you can speak directly with us. But just to kick things off, I had a couple of things that crossed my mind, Bala, that I would quickly sort of touch on with you. But as I say, because I have the issue with my audio, I'm going to sort of say it now, and then I'm going to stop, and I'm going to let you just talk as much as you like, because mine's going to lag. Oh, we have a couple of questions first. We'll prioritize those from the audience. So can you comment about the strength of the material under stress? We have that question, first question.
Okay, yeah, that's an excellent question. So when you say strength, we are talking about the morphology of the material and also the rigidity of the material. Both are important components. So the strength of the material will be compromised, and if we don't have any kind of self-aggregation, or the aggregates are loosely formed. So in our case, when you do the pyrolysis out of lignin, through aromatization, following the pre-treatment involving hydrothermal carbon, the material we have is highly rigid, and it also has a high level of porosity at the same time. So it has very good strength, and that's the reason even after doing our adsorption work at different temperatures, like 35 degrees Celsius, higher temperature, 50 degrees Celsius, and even more, and the material can still be regenerated and can be reused. If the mechanical strength of the material is lost by any chance, it will also lose its adsorption capacity in terms of removing CO2 and retaining it onto the surface, which we did not observe. Yeah, so I would say the mechanical strength is reasonably retained, to be cautious. Okay, and the next question is what type of agricultural biomass? But it depends on one of the important requirements is that the waste to biomass should be lignocellulosic biomass. So if you have non-lignocellulosic biomass, in other words, we don't have lignin, it cannot produce carbon foam, because the primary requirement for carbon foam to be formed is aromatization. In other words, the aromatic segments of the biomass will be kind of consolidated to form a macro structure. So aromatic compounds are usually found in lignin. So in cellulose, in hemicellulose, you find aliphatic compounds and sugars and so on, sucrose, but you don't find a lot of aromatic compounds. So the selection of biomass is important. In particular, I would say lignocellulosic biomass, it's an important requirement. So the next question is, okay, we have done our work with agricultural waste, and we have also used horticultural waste as well, and the same technology seems to be applicable to such waste materials as well. Any special criterion? And the criterion, of course, it should be lignocellulosic biomass, as I mentioned before, and it should be easily processed. It can be easily processed, in other words, over here. And what we have done is like the proof of concept. What we are doing now is the proof of value. Okay, so the value chain is important. So if we can come up with a kind of pilot scale plant, so then we can figure out as to what kind of bio waste cannot be processed or what can be processed. So we've not reached that stage yet to confirm as to what kind of biomass waste cannot be processed, especially among lignocellulosic waste materials. Okay, one more question. The pre-treatment of the biomass, yes, of course. Yes, of course, the pre-treatment conditions are important. In particular, we are talking about the addition of an alkali like sodium hydroxide, tiny little amount, not a major amount, because addition of an alkali like sodium hydroxide would lead to the disintegration of the biomass, lignocellulosic biomass. And then when you add an acid, again in low amount, like hydrochloric acid, that will lead to the precipitation of the liquid. The lignin we have in the liquid, then you have a solid material over there, and it can be processed in our pyrolysis reactor. So the pre-treatment conditions are important in that regard. And likewise, when you do pyrolysis, we have to maintain a temperature of 600 degrees Celsius for about 2 hours. So we have tried to optimize the experimental conditions. Under these conditions, for the biomass feedstock that we have used, it works. But other biomass feedstocks, perhaps we have to do even more optimization and process control. Thank you. Is the material brittle? No, actually, it's pretty rigid. Yeah, and but again, you could sort of, one of the important properties here is like when you have powder, right? Like activated carbon, for example. And when you have activated carbon powder, you can actually pack it in an adsorption column, with more material. And the downside is that it will introduce pressure drop. In addition to the pressure drop, there will be also kind of loss in adsorption capacity because there will be a mass transfer limitation. But in our case, the material we are using, the 3D macro structure, it basically facilitates the mass transfer because diffusion really happens favorably, followed by adsorption. So the mass transfer limitation, whatever you would have with other materials, can be overcome with our material. And at the same time, because it's rigid, it could be also used multiple number of times, and there's no pressure drop. Or the pressure drop, if any, is minimal. Yeah, graphitization. Okay, so basically when I say graphitization, basically what I'm talking about is like is a conversion of sp3 hybridized carbon that we have in lignin to sp2 hybridized carbon. So this is what we could find when you look at the transmission electron microscope of our material, and you could see something more like a graphene-like material, right? And the graphene-like material, we are very cautious. We don't want to call it graphene. We call it graphene-like material. The graphene-like material becomes evident with the presence of sp2 hybridized carbon. And that is the result of aromatization that we have from the lignin feedstock we get from the biomass waste. This is what I mean by graphitization. Yeah, so that's again self-aggregation through self-foaming. And self-foaming is a collective term, but involves several steps, as I mentioned, including self-polymerization and then degassing, and finally the foam is formed. Yeah, so graphitization is a technique through which the carbon foam that we are looking for can be produced in a significant amount with a high level of purity. Okay, I hope I have answered all questions. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, back to you, Mitchell.
Thank
you
you
have
so
questions
much,
for me?
Bala. Yes, so we more or less, that is the program for today. Thank you so much for all of your insight, Bala. It's been an honor to have you with us today. I will just quickly, for those of us who are returning next time, I will just touch on our next presentation, which will be on Thursday, the 4th of May, 2023 at 10 o'clock a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So this exact same time as now in 2 weeks. We have Giselle Azimi from the University of Toronto in Canada, who will be speaking with us on the topic of application of supercritical fluid extraction for recycling of waste electrical and electronic equipment. So be sure to check back with me in 2 weeks' time for that presentation. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you so much, Bala, for your presentation. And I hope to see you all in a couple of weeks. So
thank you once again, Mitchell, for organizing this virtual event. I appreciate it. And again, I thank members of the audience for your active participation. You do have my email address. Feel free to contact me if you have more questions. Thank you once again. Take care. Bye-bye.